Hello, my name is Tomasita Isabel Alvarenga Orellana, and now I'm going to talk about first and second language acquisition. First and second language acquisition, a brief comparison. First language acquisition is the children's acquisition of their native language, and second language acquisition is the learning a language after acquire the mother tongue. The first language is a subconscious process, and the second is an active and conscious process. The first language does not require explicit instructions or education, and the second one, yes, it requires explicit instruction or education, and the first language learners reach native fluency, and second language acquisition often difficult to reach native like fluency. And to get more specific, first language acquisition actually refers to the infant's acquisition of their native language. They acquire language through a subconscious process and are unaware to grammar rules. Children do usually not require explicit instruction to learn their first language. Um, as I said before, the first language doesn't not require a knowledge or an ability, and the second language is learning a second language after the first language is already learned. Anyone can learn a second language, but children usually find it easier. In fact, this is a process of learning. Learning occurs actively and consciously through explicit instructions and educations. Comparing and contrasting first and second language acquisition implication for language teacher. Well, the first and the second language acquisition, scholars have put forward many theories. These theories can aid language teacher to understand language learning and to assist their students in their language learning process. Those theories has been created to understand better or to get more knowledge about the nature of the first and second language acquisition. Various aspects were examined, compared, and contrasted. Results from this comparison and contrast have valuable implications for language teacher, which can help them to design their syllables, teaching process, and classroom activities. These results also enable the language teacher to understand her student learning process. Also, we have some difference between first and second language acquisition. Well, first language acquisition is children's acquisition, and as I say before, and second language acquisition is learning language after acquire the mother's tongue. The process is while the first language acquisition is a subconscious process, second language acquisition occurs actively and consistently. The education and instruction. First language acquisition does not require explicit instruction or education, while the language acquisition requires explicit instruction and education, and many more. Similarities between first and second language acquisition. We have a lot of similarities between those language acquisition, and here I have someone's developmental sequences, acquisition orders, linguistic universal and markedness, input, behaviorist views and of behaviorist views of language acquisition, zone of proximal development, and many more. But some another similarities are that in both first and second language acquisition, universal grammar may influence learning. In second language learning, universal grammar may influence learning either independently or through the first language. And another one is in both first and second language acquisition, there are unpredictable stage and particular structures are acquired in a set orders. Individuals may move more slowly or quickly through this stage, but they cannot skip ahead. And also, in both first and second language acquisition, making errors is a part of, of learning. Learners need to make and test hypothetic about language to build an internal representation of the language in the initial stage of learning. Learners may use chunks of language without breaking them down or processing them as independent units. In learners in later stage, they may make new errors as they begin to process the part of each chunk according to the rules of their language system. For example, a learner may start out using the correct form of a regular verb as part of a language chunk, but later overgeneralize and place a regular affix on that the same verb. Also, to get more specific in developed sequences, researchers have carried out numerous studies to understand the nature of the first and second language acquisition. And these studies have related has both first and second language learner follow a pattern of development, which is mainly following the specific exceptions. And of course, the acquisition order. Researchers have tried to find out if there is an order of acquisition in acquired grammatical morphemes. And linguistic universal and markedness. There are two approaches to linguistic universal. The first approach was put forward by Greenberg, and a term typological universal. Typological universal are based on cross-linguistic comparison on a wide range of language terms from different language families to discover which features they have in common. And input is defined as language which a learner hears or receives and from which he or she can learn. And behavior views of language acquisition. The similarity between first and second language acquisition is seen in the behaviorist approach originally, which tries to explain learning in general. In zone of proximal develop, the Russian psychologist Vygotsky has made a social emphasis on the education in general and language education in the particular. Differences in first and second language acquisition. Everyone acquires a first language, but not everyone acquires a second language. Acquiring a first language happens naturally, while acquiring a second language often requires conscious effort of the part of the learning. And also the acquisition learning hypothesis Kristen in 1982 claims that there are two ways for an adult to approach a second language. Adults can acquire, which is the way children get their first language subconsciously through informal implicit learning, and quite distinct from acquisition in language 2 in the second language conscious learning. This is a knowing about knowledge, explicit formal linguistic knowledge of a language. And I make a mistake. I put twice the one of the difference, that is the acquisition learning hypothesis. Well, the second one should be neurological considerations. There is an attempt to explain the difference between first and second language acquisition through lateralization in the brain. Well, and the third one, psychomotor consideration. Uh, This consideration try to explain the reason why adult second language learner cannot obtain native-like pronunciation in the second language, starting from birth. Speech muscles gradually develop until after the age of 5. And the last one, affective consideration. Although the affective domain includes many factors such as inhibition, attitude, anxiety, and the motivation, this paper will examine only the first two, while anxiety and motivation are mainly related to adult second language learning. Child first language learners have not developed or are just in the process of developing such an effective factor. And implication for language teacher. Well, to understand the nature of the first language acquisition, researchers have tried to explain how children progress from no language to their mother tongue. In the second language acquisition, however, the process is much more complicated as learners already have knowledge of the first language acquisition. And for me, it's easy to understand this because, well, eh, I think that it's more difficult to get or to learn another language because sometimes the accent, the pronunciation, and those things are very important. And talking about my personal case or my point of view, um, learning English has been a little bit difficult for me because sometimes I think that I don't have the motivation, the correct motivation, but now I think yes. And well, I think that's all my participation. Thank you for pay attention.